Welcome back to the PR Report, Episode 6. We're continuing our look at the sovereign individual, mastering the transition to the information age. Today, going over Chapter 6, which is the Megapolitics of the information age, the triumph of efficiency over power. The authors describe history's central dilemma as how to fend off violent aggression. Every modern society has to figure out how to protect life and property. They cite medieval historian Frederick C. Lane's work from 1966 entitled The Economic Meaning of War and Protection. And in that, Lane points out that organization and control of violence determines the use of resources. And the production of violence is usually not considered economic output. And that the control of violence is crucial to the economy, thus government's primary role of protection from violence. They point out that the industrial age throughout the 20th century was framed in terms of protection versus extortion. So you have protection, you have extortion. So protection, again, means to keep safe from harm or injury. You want to preserve or guarantee by means of formal or legal measures. Contrast that with extortion, which is the practice of obtaining something, especially money, through force or threats. And that the rise of large-scale factories and mass production enterprises also allowed for bigger government and labor unions, and this tipped the favor towards extortion. Again, government's primary role was to protect, but in the 20th century, we saw large-scale factories and mass production enterprises, and government started taxing more and more. And what kind of taxing did they do? There's different types. On the owner capitalist side, they had corporate taxes, property taxes, severance taxes. If you're a worker, you had income taxes. So all throughout this period of the 20th century, yes, incomes were rising, but government's revenues were rising through the seizure of property, i.e. their taxation was going through the roof. And it ended up costing less. The cost for protection ended up being less than what they were charging for it. But if you remember from what we discussed in the previous video, going over Chapter 5, the U.S. government operated more like a business run by its employees. And as we covered, businesses run by employees have little to no incentives in bringing down prices, i.e. taxes. Also in this scenario of large-scale factories and mass production. And so on the other side of this, you had unions, and they were able to do things like boycotts, strikes, walkouts, and they also enjoyed rising incomes. So in the information age, we're seeing the swinging of this pendulum between extortion and protection going back into the favor of protection. Let's take a look at that. Where previously we had throughout the 20th century large groupings of capital and wealth, which led to vulnerabilities and having capital seized, as we covered above, we in the information age are trending towards information and computational products and services in favor of manufacturing, microprocessing-based technological advances in favor of machine power, workstations in favor of factories, and small teams and autonomous organizations or even individuals in favor of mass production. The authors point out that no government has ever established stable monopolies of coercion over the open sea. And again, they cite Frederick C. Lane talking about this. And so they compare this inability to monopolize violence on the open seas to what's going to be happening in cyberspace, and seeing cyberspace as being unmonopolizable from any violence-using enterprise. Their quote is, "It's even less likely that a government could successfully monopolize an infinite realm without physical boundaries." So let's take a look at how. The characteristics of information technology that are taking place in the information age that will swing this pendulum back in favor of protection over extortion. So one, they say information technology has negligible natural resource content. Most information tech is highly portable. So if you have an information technology company or service, you're less likely to be bound geographically to an area that's close to a natural resource that your business depends upon. So you don't have to be close to a mine or a railroad depot or a shipping port or anything like that. It's sort of location agnostic. Two, information tech lowers the scale of enterprise. You don't have to have a large-scale operation or this huge factory to be effective or to deliver large amounts of value in that sector of the economy. 3. Falling scale in enterprise also implies that efforts to secure above market wages, like the unions did throughout the 20th century when they were boycotting and striking and walking out, those are less likely to command broad social support as they did in the industrial period. 4. Information tech lowers capital costs. You don't have to go out and buy these huge factories and buy these huge tracts of land that they got to be put up on. You can just rent out some small office space area, perhaps ephemerally, just when you need it, and have some laptops and some workstations. So the capital costs are a lot lower. 5. Information tech shortens the product life cycle. This is a big change because the life cycle of products were typically much longer throughout the industrial era than they are in the emerging information age. 6. Information tech is not typically sequential, but simultaneous and dispersed. 7. Microprocessing individualizes work. And they say that microprocessing-based technologies are putting a downward pressure to the returns of violence, as was characteristic in the 20th century. Cyberspace-based assets and services will be less threatened, if at all, by any individual government's territorial monopoly on violence. These resources are going to be outside of the realm of predation. The immunity to shakedown and theft and predation, they'll be easier to protect because there is a lack of threat of physical violence. And it thwarts nation-state and union tactics that thrived increasingly throughout the 20th century. So government, in their mind, in the mind of the authors, the government becomes redundant, less of a need to protect physically. And their quote from regarding that point is, government will be no better situated to protect a bank balance in cyberspace than you are. So this puts a downward pressure on its prices or taxes. And I kind of somewhat agree with this, but also disagree because it assumes the government doesn't have a reason to shift or won't shift priorities from physical protection to another type of protection based on the emerging changes that unfold. It's hard to predict, obviously, but I don't think it's quite that easy that there's going to be an overall redundancy of government. That may be the case, and obviously we'll see. Individuals will have more choices for economic services online. Further pressurizes the government to lower prices, i.e. taxes, for their services, charge a fair price. Quote here is, the advent of the cyber economy will at long last finally expose the welfare state to genuine competition, thus landing it where protection is greater than extortion. So to summarize here, the 20th century saw the rise of large-scale factories and mass production enterprises. These factories and enterprises tended to centralize large amounts of capital. That capital was preyed upon and vulnerable to attack. This predation and aggression was experienced via government taxation and coercion from labor unions who demanded higher wages. Because enterprises in the information age would operate in a decentralized, asynchronous, geographically agnostic, less capital-intense environment, and at a smaller scale, they should expect significantly less taxation and coercion. Labor unions would evaporate without the large groupings of capital from which they could exploit, and government would experience a downward pressure on its ability to tax more than the cost of the primary service it provides. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.